thanks so much for the warm introduction. You have nothing to fear, I don't work on the benefit side. Speaking in a place where there have been famous speakers for 400 years is a rather daunting prospect, and particularly when I know that I'm standing in for Avinash's valedictory lecture. In my silly moments, I think perhaps thought that he might get us confused and but the good news is you will hear him again, so you get the best of both worlds. In all seriousness, let me thank Gresham College and Avinash for this honour. What I propose to do this evening is to pose the question whether the investment chain is working as well as it needs to work. I should stress that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, although obviously I'm informed by the work that I'm doing at USS and the Enhanced Analytics Initiative. And what I aim to do tonight, and I'm planning to speak for about 20-25 minutes, is to explain the disconnect that I see between what pension fund members really need and what the pension fund system is designed to deliver. And I'm not blaming anyone in that partnership, but there is a disconnect, in my opinion. And then I'll illustrate that disconnect with particular reference to the investment chain, the research part of the investment chain. And then I'll explain a little bit about why I think that focusing on what we're calling extra financial issues is part of the way forward. And in that I'll talk about this initiative called the Enhanced Analytics Initiative, EAI. And finally, I'll put that particular initiative into context of the wider changes that I think are also needed. So let's start with the disconnect, if I may. I think there are two components to the disconnect. First is that pension fund members want an absolute pension. You can't eat a relative pension. The relative returns and relative risks that define how the investment system works, whether a return is greater or lesser than a benchmark or a peer group, aren't really very helpful to the end beneficiary. But yet that is the focus of how the system works. Second, pension fund members assume that the pension fund promise equates to a pretty predictable quality of retirement life. Indeed, you could describe the pension fund product as a kind of insurance against risk to the quality of your retirement life. And this is widely understood in the economic space because we know about inflation and therefore pension funds are often wage adjusted or indexed to inflation. But retirement well-being is also linked to social capital and human capital, environmental capital. And corporations have a very big incentive to externalize whatever cost they can, particularly if it's legal, onto society, future generations, and basically to service the needs of shareholders. And that externalization of cost has direct impact to all of us around, but it certainly is going to have impact on next generations. And so the intergenerational impact of that externalization of costs is going to be pretty serious. So whilst the customer may yet be king, certainly the kind of trappings of that power situation, actually in reality there's a paradox at the heart of our financial system, our market-based financial system, and that paradox is that at any given point in the investment chain, the client tends to have less power than the supplier than is almost the case in any other sector. And it's true that we have a lot of choice over brands, different product brands, but actually when you look at the range of services and relationships that are on offer to deal with the disconnects that I just talked about, the choice isn't very great. What trustees need are investment services and partnerships which are related to delivering against the liabilities of the fund, which take a long-term view. The average member may have a lifespan in the fund of several decades, hopefully more, and will address the real responsibilities of being owners of companies. And when you collectively add up pension funds, we're very significant owners of companies. So in a real sense, we are the company. So this disconnect, which I don't think we could have talked about so openly and clearly even a few years ago, is now being openly addressed by very influential opinion shapers and commentators. And just 2 weeks ago, the chairman of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the States, said, and I just wonder whether he knew he was going to be announcing his retirement shortly, but this is what he said. Over time, analysts have become obsessed with the question of whether a company meets its quarterly EPS, earnings per share, numbers. and network where there are companies built to last. And because of the considerable clout of the sell-side analyst, this shift from long-term thinking to short-term results has echoed through to company managements and to professional investors. So why does the sell-side have so much influence? Well, I don't really have time to go through all the details of that, and there are some in the audience who I think could tell us from personal experience about the influence that the sell-side has. But for a detailed account of this, what I would urge you to do is to have a look at an article in the Harvard Business Review from a few years ago. It's a fictional letter written by a very senior business strategist it's called A Letter to the Chief Executive. And let me just use one quote to illustrate. And it's written in the form of a letter, and it says, "What bothers me is that we seem to have lost control of the situation. We spend more time talking about what the analysts think we should earn than we spend discussing what the company is capable of earning." There's pretty good academic evidence now for the negative impact that this relationship has. This relationship that's been highlighted by the chairman of the SEC, the author of this very high-powered author of this HBR report, and others. One study found that from 1999 to 2004, nearly half of the companies in the Dow Jones average always met consensus earnings estimates or beat them by a penny. Making the numbers often results in unsound corporate strategies which pay no regard to the cost of postponed investment. And according to the SEC chairman, such a goal is often achieved only by bending accounting standards, and I don't think you can get anyone more experienced than the SEC chairman to make that comment. Again, I quote another study from Duke University recently written up in the National Bureau of Economic Research papers. They interviewed 401 senior finance directors, CFOs and FDs. And of that group, 78% said they would sacrifice an initiative which was expected to create economic value if it would negatively impact on their ability to smooth out earnings. So if you aggregate this situation, this is pretty serious. And Chairman Donson didn't mention one of the areas where it's most serious, and that's its impact on society, but that's okay, he covered it a lot in his speech. But when companies are heavily focused on those short-term earnings and meeting analyst expectations, well, they have very strong incentives to externalize costs. That's an economic term for basically saying to offload what they can offload onto customers, employees, other companies, future generations, the environment, wherever they can legally and sometimes not legally offload those costs. And let me quote the Business Council of Australia, which is the equivalent of our CBA. They interviewed, and this is a quote, "Interviews with leading corporate managers, investors and other major participants suggest that short-termism is increasingly a driver of market behavior and a potential constraint on long-term value creation." That what's the result of that? They go on to say, "We are discounting the benefits that result from long-term thinking and strategic planning and not adequately planning and investing for our future." And they conclude, "Australia's ability to sustain economic growth and thereby sustain individual well-being and quality of life over time is likely to be compromised." So that's the equivalent of the CBA. And here in this country, because this is a global problem, the miners' review process has started to deal with the same issue of time horizons. So, what is the answer? This is a lecture about the way forward, and I would say, let's start with what's not the answer, what's not needed. There's endless potential to have a blame game between company management, sell-side analysts, and buy-side about who is most responsible for short-termism and these inappropriate signals. Notice how I put asset owners happily outside this menage a trois, because clearly we're only bystanders and we have no influence in this process. But seriously, each constituency has its role to play, and for example, company management could do much more to report on these extra financial issues. Auditors could do much more to better assure investors about the quality of reporting on those new issues. So everyone's got a role to play, and that's not the solution to accept that. I happen to come from the investment industry, so I'm going to focus what I say on what we could do. And in my opinion, the key thing that we could do is to become a lot more professional about what we're calling extra financial issues. The name hasn't really settled, so different people call it different things. Some people call it intangible, some people call it non-financial issues. In America, they call it corporate risk, enterprise risk issues, long-term value drivers. You can see from all of those names we haven't yet settled on exactly what it is, but we all mean the same thing. Fundamentals that have the potential to impact company financial performance or reputation in a material way, but which aren't, at least at present, part of the fundamental research process. Extra financial issues typically include, but aren't limited to, corporate governance issues, human capital, employment standard issues, whether remuneration is aligned to business strategy, environmental and social risks, or basic reputation headline risk issues. So they may be specific to a company, they may be sector-wide, or they may be much broader. And something like climate change is one of those issues, one of those much broader issues that affects the market as a whole. And the consideration and evaluation of all these risks, including these extra financial issues, is critical for us as the end beneficiary and the representatives thereof, because they affect the company's ability to deliver shareholder value and drive competitive advantage, particularly over the medium and longer term, when they define how a company is going to be positioned vis-à-vis its peers. The good news is that the investment world is changing, and as we all know, and 400 years in this city has shown us that major changes are possible in the financial world, but fortunately I don't think it's going to take 400 years. The evidence for this change has come recently from Mercer's, the very large global investment consultancy, and they surveyed over 200 investment professionals from around the world, and found in all regions bar one that investment professionals think these extra financial issues are going to become part of the day job within 10 years. And if I could have this slide, Jeff. Sorry. Yes, so they did this survey looking at investment professionals from 5 regions of the world: Asia, Australia, Canada, across Europe and the US. And what they found was that in all regions bar one, and it's the US I hate to say, investment professionals see this becoming part of their day job within 10 years. That's right. Does that work? You probably all saw the slide beforehand, so I don't need to test you on it. It's coming. And if that works. So you can see on that slide, and I've highlighted the US box, and this is how grateful to nurses. On the waterfront, whether it's the active ownership front or whether it's the screening front, the most important front for us is the integration of environmental social issues into corporate performance and therefore analysis. Investment professionals think that it's going to happen pretty quickly, and in Europe, a sizable minority, 25%, think it's going to happen within 1 to 2 years. As an aside, in the States, the majority think it will never happen, and I think that's quite interesting because I don't know of any other issue like this where investment professionals will say something will never happen. But anyway, leave that aside. Things are changing, and this is where we could switch it off now. And this is where the Enhanced Analytics Initiative seeks to come in. It's a project designed to ease this development and to help the market orient itself towards the long term. It does this by making sure that fund managers are equipped with better research about the future prospects of particular companies in particular industries. EAI's consortium, which in and of itself is kind of interesting in a highly competitive sector like the fund management community, and also includes both asset owners, pension funds and foundations, and fund managers, money managers. It's designed to give research houses a commercial incentive to produce innovative and differentiated research, which captures and then integrates all of this useful insight into the traditional analyst note. Put simply, it gives analysts a reason to care about commenting on what's material for their company or their sector. The specific commitment that we've all made is to allocate a minimum of 5% of our brokerage fees, and that might not seem a lot, but when you add us up, it's not insignificant. I'll come to that. 5% of our brokerage commissions to research houses who we deem to be good at doing this work, and we do this evaluation every 6 months, so we keep people on their toes, hopefully. Based on the current group composition, and I'll just run through the names because I think you'll know many of them as mainstream players: AGF Asset Management, BNP Paribas Asset Management, Deutsche Investment Trust, and Dresdner Bank Investment Management, Generation Investment Management, our own London Pension Fund Authority, Mistra, which is a large Swedish government foundation, KPGM, which is the second largest Dutch pension fund, RCM, the big UK part of Allianz Global, SNS Real, TUC Superannuation Scheme, ourselves. So, and this group is growing all the time. Together, we account for about, if our trading activity is the same this year as it was last, we will be giving about €8 million through the EAI process. So that's not an insignificant amount, particularly for what's called tier 2 brokers, second tier brokers. We stress the carrot, that 8 million, but we don't. But also, I think it's pretty obvious to brokers that we're all the time contracting our supply chain, and at least one of the members of the EAI has made clear that proficiency and performance on EAI issues is one of the criteria they'll use in contracting their supply chain. So there is a stick as well, but we prefer to focus on the carrot. So what are the benefits of this initiative? Let me start with an independent view first. Again, I quote from Mercer's. We think it's an innovative approach which differs from others under the broad SRI umbrella in that EAI targets sell-side segment of the investment community. And they're right. Let me just tell you about the specific benefits that we hope we'll be able to realize over time. I'll start at the top of the investment chain, which is with the asset owners. Asset owners who pay for active management, who are seeking what's in the trade called alpha, have a particular interest in knowing that their fund managers are getting the best information feeds that they can. After all, it really is client money that's being spent on brokers. And just because an individual analyst misses something that the community of analysts miss, and then it nicely becomes called an exogenous event, that's really not very good enough for us. And so those of us who have an active management strategy, most pension funds do, sometimes very heavily dependent on active management, this is an important thing. But also for those of us who are significantly passively allocated, who depend on the data, EAI adds value in the same way that herd immunity and public health strategy adds value to a person's individual health. Passive investors have a strong interest in seeing the gap between what's called fair value and market price narrowing, and to ensure that actually the real risks and the real rewards that are in any company, so for example, we all know that Merck's share price fell by 40% very suddenly. Well, some of that information was known before, indeed hedge funds were trading on it well before. And so closing that gap between market price and fair value is very important for passive fund managers who don't want to end up holding the cost of that gap, if not being priced in. But there's a wider value of this, which is that as analysts begin to focus more on the fundamentals, it will increase incentives on company managers to really manage risk well, and that will inevitably reduce the bubble effect that we so fear. All of this should help create more positive externalities and less negative externalities, and because we own a slice of the universe of stocks, actually pension funds will also have a slice of that extra benefit. So in a very simple way, I would say EAI should help, and we don't know how much, but it should help move the index in the right direction. We all like an index that's going up. So asset owners have a strong case for supporting EAI and are increasingly joining it as what we're calling associate members. Indeed, 2 or 3 have already indicated that they will be using EAI as a criteria for selecting their fund managers when they next launch their corporates and their mandates. So moving down the investment chain, fund managers also have a strong interest for wanting to join for the same reasons. They can help themselves avoid risk, find alpha or avoid negative alpha, and they can help with the new ownership responsibilities that asset owners are putting on them. So I think we all know that there's a lot more effort going into activism and engagement as being engaged owners, and actually the data that's available to support that is not yet adequate. One area that's particularly worrisome is the non-alignment of remuneration strategy with business strategy. And as yet, there are very few products in the market which will really get to the heart of that question. So, obviously, membership makes most sense for fund managers who take a fundamental and long-term approach. In joining EAI, fund managers are also sending a signal that they have the confidence to acknowledge that clients are worried about how the system's working at the moment and have some questions of trust in the system. And so fund managers are saying, where we can, we will align our internal processes with the needs of clients. And that's obviously a reassuring sign for us, because it means they're able to overcome the internal cultural obstacles to joining EAI, and I'll talk about those in a minute. The benefits don't even stop at the buy side, and I'm here to promote EAI, so I would say that, wouldn't I? But, good analysts actually like doing interesting analysis, because that's why they became analysts. They're rather bored with doing commentaries on last month's quarter and acting as ambassadors for stocks which they may or may not really believe in. So perhaps even more important than that, from a corporate perspective, brokers are feeling a big squeeze. The analyst business model is not a healthy model to be in at the moment. It's being squeezed by regulatory attention, but it's also being squeezed by the move to unbundling, the move away from putting all fees into one package and paying for it as such. All of this is summarized very succinctly, as they do, by a McKinsey report, which is entitled More Relevant Research at Lower Cost. Not an easy time for brokers, but basically EAI is a group of clients of not insignificant size who are saying what we are happy to pay for. And so for that reason, I think it's actually a positive development. And finally, there are the benefits of company management. You will have analysts who really understand the kind of range of issues that they're juggling with and have to move ahead all the time in parallel. Because really you cannot be a good corporate manager looking at one indicator. It's a bit like flying a plane looking at one dial. It might be possible for a bit, but there's a danger ahead. So it's beneficial for many people. So I guess the question then is, why hasn't it happened already? Why am I here talking about it? Well, as with any market failure, it's possible to compete on the back of that market failure, do quite well for yourself, arguably exacerbate that market failure, certainly do nothing to address it. That's not terribly helpful for all the reasons I outlined basically earlier, and the EAI attempts to begin to address that market failure in research. It's not going to take away competition amongst analysts and amongst fund managers. It's just going to, as any initiative does, which increases transparency and efficiency, it's going to change the rules of that competition. There are going to be different people who are suited to winning and different people who are going to be losers in this game. Another big reason why it's not happened is because change is very difficult. For those of you who are not in the investment business and don't know really how the culture of it, I think I could say that the relationships between a portfolio manager, fund manager, and his or her broker is second in terms of sensitivity only to his or her personal bonus. And so change isn't a very easy thing to organize in this sector. So for EAI to really succeed, what's needed? Well, it's obvious. More and more asset owners and fund managers need to come into the game and increase the size of the pot. It's a very simple initiative. It's from the city, by the city. It's a buy-side initiative. The good thing about the city and the pension fund board in particular is that we're constantly benchmarking ourselves against each other. Some people tend to call it a herd instinct, but actually the positive side of that is we're always looking at how we can benchmark ourselves and improve. And so I have no doubt that there will be others showing leadership on this front very soon, and indeed we know of one large fund manager who will be joining in the near future. What I want to stress is that EAI isn't a magic bullet. There aren't no magic bullets. It can't by itself reorient the investment chain towards being long-term and responsible. Other things are needed, and I'd be happy to take questions about some of those other things. But you really do have to start somewhere in the process, and asking fund managers what steps they've taken to secure systematic and quality coverage of extra financial issues, and getting coverage of a kind that you can then be sure that their portfolio managers actually use, that doesn't just sit on their screen because it's nice to have there as a compliance thing. That's a pretty good place to start, and it's certainly a good place that all pension funds and investment consultants could start off with. These and the other changes that I was alluding to are going to take a bit of time and effort to deliver. But pension fund members have very real expectations about the quality of their retirement life. And, you know, we shouldn't deal with those responsibilities lightly. So I'm very pleased to be here to tell you about the Advanced Analytics Initiative, and I guess the proof of the pudding will be next year when we announce our new members. Thank you. I'm told there's time for questions, and so I'm very happy to take questions now or afterwards. There's also a microphone which is used for the webcast.
Forgive me, I'd like to ask a quite complex and challenging question, because I'm sceptical, I'm not sure what I'm saying. Pension funds surely own some 20% of the UK stock market, and I suspect they're they're not nearly active enough in bouncing up and down unperforming companies. They're far too tolerant of what is going on, and surely the nub of it is less the external factors of corporate social responsibility and corporate governance, with rare salient exceptions, but it's more that, as you said at the very beginning of your talk, one can't eat to relative performance, and I suggest to you that pension funds, along with other institutional investors, are far too tolerant of negative total shareholder return. The FTSE 100 5-year total shareholder return is negative, which means that many of our top companies are losing investors' money. And you touched on remuneration reports. There are surely far too many remuneration reports condoned by institutional investors among pension funds, which are preoccupied with the company's relative performance against a supposed peer group, to the neglect of the more fundamental issue of whether they're actually earning money for their investors, for their shareholders. And pension funds are not alone in this. The insurers are, I suggest, falling down in the same way. Private investors are exasperated by the large votes, almost routinely in favour of motions at company AGMs. And just one FTSE 100 company, GlaxoSmithKline, has had a remuneration report voted down. In other words, perhaps infer, I'm seething with exasperation, and I wonder whether your proposed initiative is going to focus merely on peripherals, and that really what you should be doing is going straight to the heart of the issue and exerting your rights as investors, and after all custodian of the investments of numerous private individuals in demanding performance from these underperforming companies, because it's not coming at the moment, and my impression is that it won't come unless the institutions exert themselves along vigorously. And I just wonder whether the focus of your initiative is straight to the throat, as that really should be, rather than getting sidetracked.
A very interesting and well-explained point of view. I agree a lot with it, and here I can't speak for the pension fund community as a whole, I can only speak for USS. And what I can say about USS is that our directors, our trustees have mandated us to be very active in this space. And so we would have been one of the companies, investors who were very active with the GSK, Paydeal, and many others. I have to say that it's still quite rare, and so my advice to you would be to become a trustee of a big pension fund and change it, because you clearly have the right idea, and that's not said flippantly. The area which I would challenge you on is your assertion that this is tangential. Actually, that's not correct. The wealth of high-level strategy and corporate views that we are picking up now from our role as major investors is that these extra financial issues are the reason why a large part of the reason why companies are not succeeding in delivering returns. Whether, when customer care falls in a customer care facing company, that's a very big threat to shareholder return. When a company gets its license to operate wrong, like Monsanto did, that's a pretty big risk. When a company fails to mobilize its R&D staff, as the pharmaceutical sector have as a whole not been able to do well, and merged well to drive their marketing activities, which they've done well as well, that's a big risk. And so, all of these things are actually very central. And, part of it, I think, is because we don't have the right terms, and we've ended up sort of with a very dichotomous view of life. There's financial and there's this other stuff. The stuff is soft, and therefore we'll focus here on shareholder return, either defined as TSR or EPS or whatever. Actually, that's very simple. And what we're learning, and interestingly, if you've been watching how McKinsey have been talking recently, what they've learned, I think it's fair to say, is that corporate health depends on these things. You can shape the numbers at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 quarters, but when you're trying to do it over a medium and long term, on that basis, you destroy a company. So, yes, I agree with you. Yes, you should join a pension fund and become one of the trustees. And then it would be lovely to work with you because we love collaborating with other pension funds. And would you join me?
Yes, you were talking about investment analysts. In the last few years, there have been an avalanche of criticism for things like Enron and WorldCom and so on, that their reports were, to put it mildly, unobjective, and there were huge pressure to put on analysts to produce strong buy reports. I think people were, Bankers Trust, producing strong buys for Enron about a month before it collapsed. And obviously, the whole system was, frankly, crooked. That I think a few years ago, only about 3% of all analysts' reports were sell recommendations. And there was a huge pressure by companies, by bankers and so on, to produce strong buy reports. Has anything changed since the disaster of Enron and WorldCom?
I joined USS just coming up to 5 years ago, so I caught the tail end of that period. And so I'll give you my personal view of that change. I think the activity undertaken by Eliot Spitzer in New York and then copied and expanded on by other states has had a measurable improvement on conflicts of interest. But we have in the audience a very senior analyst from KLD, Peter Hinder, and so I'll turn, when I finish, to him to answer that question. But my sense is, yes, it's improved it. I also think it hasn't actually improved it enough. The core of the business model remains fixed very closely to the advisory function, to the investment banking function, and many senior analysts that we talk to will tell us in private that is the case, but they have to be much more careful about how they do it and when they do it and the conflicts that they do it. And the area where it's happened most is in the procedures. I think it's also the improvements have happened in procedures. I think it's had some content improvement, and I think fortunately in the UK we were less, not completely, but less affected by the problem to start with. But Peter, what's your sense from the States?
I think you've described it quite accurately. The problem is much more deep-seated in the United States because we went through a period around South Africa which resulted in tremendous pushback by the financial services sector against including these concepts in the investment decision-making process. But what we're now seeing with global climate change issues, we're seeing a lot of interest, albeit not formal, not stated in the research, in these issues. I expect that the Mercer numbers will probably turn around.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As an analyst, I wish that you'd been around with this EAI when I've been an analyst, because I have been very much the issues that you've raised. But through your talk, you didn't mention what I think is going to be the most important initiative. Let's start again. The most important initiative you didn't mention was the operating financial review, which is designed to look at non-financial factors, and I think that in itself should help to concentrate both the buy side and the sell side's minds on these issues. I wonder if you could say to what extent you think, if that's successful, the EAI would sort of set the ball rolling, and then the other parties should complete it, and possibly your initiative will sort of do itself out of a job.
Just to say, actually our strongest supporters for this project are the good sell-side analysts. Some of the top-ranked sell-side analysts really like this project, and certainly some of the heads of global research for the sell-side like it, for the reason that you mentioned. It motivates the good sell-side analysts, and you will ones. There you go. The question of the OFI, you're absolutely right, is very important. The Operating Financial Review is a government initiative which is going to be rolled out from 2006 onwards, where companies will have to effectively report on these sort of issues. And I think that's going to have a big impact, because it's going to put into the official domain management information of a kind that hasn't previously been available to investors. And auditors are gearing up to be able to provide assurance functions on that. Management processes are gearing up to deliver against that, and we're very hopeful that this will help. Interesting, I saw a survey that 50% of institutional investors aren't interested in whether this happens or not, which I found bizarre. Anyway, that is the case, and it goes back to the gentleman's point about short-termism. So the key is it's going to happen. It's also not just in the UK, it's happening in Canada. There's it's called the MD&A process, I think. In the States, there is a private sector initiative called the Enhanced Business Reporting Consortium. There's something in Denmark, there's something here. It's happening around the world, and globally there's also a project called the Global Reporting Initiative, which is trying to do similar things. And so for a range of from a range of reasons, quality reports are going to be out there, which will mean that quality data is out there, which will mean that analysts have for the first time a much broader spectrum of thinking. Does it do EA out of the business? No, because actually that won't necessarily mean that analysts will want to analyse it, because analysts will do what they're paid to do. And if analysts are paid, and I've seen analysts' personal, individual profit and loss accounts on a week-by-week basis, they know what they're getting paid for, and so they'd be stupid not to do next week what they got paid for last week and the week before. You're asking someone to do something that's not in their job interest. So we have to change what analysts are paid for. And we hope to go out of business in 5 years as well, because we hope that extra financial becomes part of financial, and then the term's meaningless.
Is part of the project that you're concerned with grading the performance of these funds? In fact, the USSS is what the management fund.
What we're doing is we're evaluating the analysts.
We evaluate them on their performance.
Yes.
And then you grade the one that made the most money last year is who?
Well, what we're evaluating the analysts on is the quality of the research.
What about the success of the research? I mean, did my money increase last year, or did it go down?
Are you only interested?
Most of my funds did.
Are you interested in last year or the long term?
And the future is what I'm really interested in.
It's a very good question to ask, and the way that pension funds evaluate their returns is improving all the time. Some schemes are defined benefit schemes, which
But do they issue a report on which did better, or is this?
yes.
Where will you find such a report? Is there some kind of overall classification somewhere?
there are agencies that look at it.
But do they,
Whether they-
Financial Times, I can't.
Whether they report to the public, I'm not so sure. Can someone help me out? I mean, we have access to that data and we use that as a benchmarking tool, but I'm not sure that all member of the public does. So I can't answer, I'm sorry.
As a non-financial person, I'm still confused about the long-term incentive for people to look at these externalities long-term, particularly across the pension point of view. I can understand that some of them have relatively short-term implications as well. I can take those into account, but if I'm really interested in what's going to happen in 20 years, that's powerful around now,
A lot of professionals aren't really interested in what's going to happen around 20 years, and arguably the investment consultancy or the actuarial world specialises in that. Now, they have a particular definition of what they consider and their particular methodologies about how they process those issues, and say climate change isn't the risk associated with that to gross national product isn't part of their methodology yet. So I think the answer is we all are interested technically in 20 years. I think our methodologies are improving in leaps and bounds to try to get to what they need to be. We have a big challenge to go through. There aren't good systems in place to deal with these extra financial issues. At the moment, what we're having to do is to bring them into our investment decision-making horizon, which, given the mandates that are currently around, means that we're looking, when I say long-term, we're looking 2 to 5 years. But if you think that's depressing, you will know maybe that in some US fund manager organizations, people are on 3 monthly rolling contracts. In relative terms, that's very long term.
Yes, it's easy to talk about market failure, but you never talk about regulation failure. Because every regulation costs someone something, and quite probably the client, and of course, if the failure of the regulation, the taxpayer pays as often as not, then as soon as you have regulations, you reduce choice, so you have less free trade. Of course, everything is a gamble. These things are gambling. And a gambler must necessarily accept that he might fail. To guarantee a gamble that doesn't fail is not a gamble. And the final thing is, of course, as soon as you have regulations, there are always some clever people that get around them. So you have fraud. So this increases the chances for fraud and promotes fraud throughout the whole system. So that regulation failure is far worse than the market failure ever could be in the long term.
I'm an investment professional, so I'm going to stick to what I know about, which is investment. And also, I don't want to tread on Avinash's toes, which is on regulatory issues. And so I would urge you to come back for that lecture, because I'm sure we'll touch on it. The key for us is having a consistent regulatory framework allows us to make investment decisions which mean that we can take into account risk in a way which we then don't pass on to either our sponsor or the end beneficiary. And where regulation is either fluctuating very variably or inappropriately implemented, either as a result of bribery or corruption or whatever influence process is happening, then we find it much harder to make sensible decisions about investment risk, and then it's a question of just chucking it out at a dartboard and seeing whether you're going to make money. At that point, we start to feel a little bit anxious as professionals.
I'm missing something on the cause and effect chain. 20% of UK PLC is owned by pension funds, and pension funds require a long-term money market. which means that 80% of UK PLC is not owned by pension funds. And we know very well that markets are driven by year-on-year performance, which is why analysts concentrate on year-on-year performance. That's who their clients are for the most part. So why is it surprising that pension funds, why does the pension fund industry feel that it is in a position to influence the other 80%? It isn't just 80%, because I'm not assuming that 80% is all short-term, but a significant proportion of short-term investors, and that by implication there's something definitely wrong with the way some markets are organised.
That is the ideological debate that's been happening for a long time, and NEPF produced a report last year which, to paraphrase, I think last year or the year before, to paraphrase James Callaghan, it was sort of short-termism. What short-termism? And that's been around for some time. I think if I were in a court of justice, I would call as my witness the SEC Commissioner, Paul Miners, and a range of other people who, from the inside, would say that this is damaging to UK PLC in a way that's getting worse. And I think at one level, it's their view versus my view versus your view.
Well, you could well be right, and so would the alternative.
I understand.
This doesn't provide us with an answer, does it?
It provides us with an answer that we have a problem.
Exactly.
And that's the first step to getting to a solution.
Are they trying to overturn the inevitable? And the inevitable is that people want to get rich today and tomorrow, for the most part, not in 5 or 25 years' time. So it's hardly surprising that share prices move on the short term. That's what the owners of shares demand.
Is economic and social progress possible? I think it
Yes,
is.
that's it. Again, you're right.
And I think, can humans learn? I think we probably can. Can pension funds have influence? We probably can. Can we work together with insurance companies who own the other 25% of companies? We probably can. They're even more long-term. Will the fund management industry, that's our supply chain, we're the clients, who own a significant part of the other bits of the companies, will they respond if we are assertive and informed? They probably will. Would individual investors who care about their investment but may not have been educated to understand that worrying about this quarter return at the expense of their absolute investment might be a bad thing, can they be educated? Yes, I think they probably can. So I think that there's a process of change that's possible. Will it happen? We hope. I certainly hope, because I have a retirement plan, and I vaguely think that I'd like my retirement to mean something. Oh, yes.
The previous speaker has suggested an idea, which is not entirely new, that surely pension funds could make much more of their collaboration with the ABI and add their 20% to the other 20%. And what about doing something more concerted about the hedge funds who own a substantial and perhaps even growing part of the UK stock market, and we're introducing a volatility which is detrimental with all sorts of arguable abuses like profitable stock lending and the rumour spreading and the short-term amount. I suggest to you in relation to your earlier comment that and from reading a lot of company reports, that the combined code that meets the FTSE 100 is broadly speaking observed, the exceptions the companies acknowledge and by and large are doing something about. I'm just worried, to appreciate your view of this, that a lot more analyst box ticking is not going to get us very far, because what is much more important in my view is doing something about the sheer underperformance of many companies and their preoccupation with earnings per share, which at best is a means to an end in the total shareholder return. and it seems to me one should narrow the focus to getting companies to earn money for their investors, in other words, to ensure that the total shareholder return is positive, and that remuneration schemes be firmly aligned on that, and not, as we're seeing, continually ratcheted up by linkage with a whole array of peripherals.
Again, and it's the same point I think you made earlier. I agree with you. I think there should be more collaboration, and we'd love to see, as a member of NAPF, we'd love to see more collaboration with ABI and NAPF. And often I think ABI has played a very important leadership role. So very strongly support you on that. I've done some work with Australian pension funds, and one of the really interesting things there is how well they collaborate, particularly the large ones, and in setting a governance agenda. And an example that comes to my mind about what's doable, so again, I'm agreeing with you, is that when News Corp was planning to relocate from Australia to America with a significant watering down of rights for that company, according to the views of those pension funds, they organised a very effective international engagement effort. Now, in this country, when BSkyB's CEO was replaced with the son of the chairman, much less activity happened. And those two examples kind of brought home to me how pension fund collaboration could be quite different. But your point, I think, maybe I haven't made it clearly enough, is not correct, which is that this is a diversion. Basically, the core of the analyst community looking at the very quarter-by-quarter number, very fixated, as you say, on the targets, and the little bit that comes with it, in terms of other financial issues, is part of the reason why company management focuses on things which destroy shareholder value over the medium and long term. The way to get around that, in part, is to make sure the research community is better focused, reporting on what's important, not box ticking, reporting on what's important, not just on financials, making that information available to fund managers, because most pension funds don't have in-house teams. We're kind of rare, but most pension funds have to rely entirely on external fund managers, and then that gives us a chance as custodians of those assets, along with our investment advisors, to hold those fund managers accountable for being active owners. But until that information is made much more available, until it becomes much more regular to have conversations, about the things that destroy shareholder value, it's not often the case. So this is part of the process, and it's in part because we have a very extended investment chain. We have pension funds mostly subcontracting to external fund managers, and that's the link that we have to help work better. I'm wondering whether we have time for one more question, or yeah, one more gentleman.
Yes. A large, plus far away scandal like Enron have any practical effect on, say, your or my pensions?
Yes, well, in our case, no, because fortunately we didn't hold it, and in any case, we are a defined benefit scheme, so it doesn't affect you, the individual member. But the aggregated impact of all of those scandals is very serious, and New York State Pension Fund, I think, calculated that their returns in aggregate were down by some very significant percentage point, and I don't have it to hand. So, these things are not good for total returns and meeting liabilities. And that's part of the reason for us wanting to understand them.
But did it have any did these scandals in America have any real effect on pensions in Britain? Do you think?
Yes, because people were invested in those companies.
Oh, there is quite a lot of transnational investment.
Our second largest, biggest market for our own fund is the US. That's where we have most invested outside the UK.
I see.
So I should thank you all for staying and asking such really interesting questions. I was told it was going to be a challenging meeting and I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Look forward to the drinks.